At the outset, I wish as a member of the Gurindji people to respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the original traditional Indigenous owners of the land on which this facility stands. The first photo I am showing is the one of Vincent Lingiari, leader of the Gurindji, with the then Prime Minister Gough Whitlam. After a 10-year strike, the Gurindji people are having some of their land returned to them. It has been agreed that the men be paid £25 a week wages and the women and children are no longer to be sexually abused and raped. The qualities I love about that picture is the dignity of mutual respect. This is true reconciliation. There is no emasculated victim and condescending benefactor. They are equals. Each has listened to the other. Saying sorry doesn't imply personal guilt, but acknowledges national shame. I don't like being ashamed of my country. There isn't a country in the world that hasn't committed human rights abuse at some stage in its history, or even currently. The second photo I have here is of my mother, my sister and myself. My mother had been forcibly removed from her mother from Wave Hill Station to the Carlin compound in Darwin for half-castes. She was my grandmother's only child. The living conditions in the Carlin compound were primitive. The superintendent in 1927, which would have been when my mother was there, reported, "The building is not only too small but very much out of repair. The floor is rotten, the shower is out of order, in the kitchen the stove is unfit for use. Worst of all was the overcrowding." It is difficult to believe, but nonetheless true, that by the late 1920s, 76 babies, children and young adults were living in a cottage, suitable for a single family. The inmates were locked in for 12 hours or more. My mother contracted TB and was dead at 29 years. These were the conditions which were supposed to promote and improve their life expectancy. My sister and I were sent down to South Australia. The priest who officiated at her funeral said it was the most desolate he had ever been present at. There was only an assistant undertaker and himself present. None of her friends, relatives or community were allowed near her as she was dying or at her funeral. When they inquired or wanted to see her, they were told by Vincent White, the Native Affairs officer, that she was none of their business. They also received the same answer when they asked where my sister and I would be going. When they did find out, their letters to us were destroyed. However, Auntie Jerry placed an advertisement in the Adelaide Advertiser in 1985, which friends of my sister and I saw and informed us of. We contacted her and she flew down from Darwin and stayed with me in Melbourne for a couple of weeks and filled me in on the circumstances of my mother's life and my own origins. Also, the tribe we came from. The word assimilation means to absorb, be like, a clone of, whereas integration, which is what migrants to Australia appropriate and embrace, means to come into equal membership disregarding race or religion. It took several generations to genetically transform my ancestral black skin into a white skin. Personally, I think you have to be seriously disconnected emotionally and spiritually to take a loved infant from its mother, and to have taken hundreds over several generations would imply a very sinister agenda. Children were still being removed in the 1970s. People say to me, "Oh, why don't you forgive and forget? That was in the dim past." The recommendation that we forget is interesting from a nation whose military motto is "lest we forget." As we sit down together and respectfully listen to each other, allow the pain to be expressed, misconceptions acknowledged, then real understanding can be possible. Also, as we allow Australian history to be told truthfully. For example, this nation was not settled peacefully, unchallenged and passively. In fact, it was acquired through battles, massacres, random killings, genocide, brutal force and the taking of prisoners, forced to serve life sentences of slavery, not to mention the enslavement and degradation of repeated rape and horrific torture of women and children. There is always a white version and a black version of events. For example, white people talk about settlement and black people of invasion. Allowing people to tell their personal story is another healing process. This is my story, my testimony of coming from a background of impoverishment, abandonment, dispossession and displacement to a measure of restoration and peace. My parents were the government and the church, plus my biological parents. Institutionalised in Church of England orphanages from the age of 18 months to 17 years. I was separated from my mother as an infant, then from my sister and family of origin. Canon Percy Smith appointed himself as my guardian and made decisions from hundreds of miles away as to what course my upbringing would take. My Aboriginal heritage was deliberately concealed from me, which made me feel it was a shameful heritage. During my upbringing, I was dispatched to strangers' homes for school holidays. In 2 of those homes, the men of the house sexually abused me. I was unable to tell anyone in the orphanage about these violations. The system I lived under was totally authoritarian and regimented, and often arbitrary in its dispensing of punishment. I remember being beaten with a thick rubber strap. It taught me to live in constant fear. A few years ago, I went up north with my 3 adult children to try and reconnect with relatives and country. We soon learnt that there was a white official version and a black version of events. I discovered I had a birth certificate and pieced together some more information as Link Up assisted me with archival documents. I was formally acknowledged as a legitimate member of the Gurindji tribe through my mother's people. A Gurindji cousin and elder had been looking for my sister and I for years. People both black and white have said to me, "How come you're still a Christian after what they did to you?" I say, Jesus didn't do that to me. I would like to conclude by showing you a photograph of my 3 adult children, their marriage partners and family dog. 2 went to university, 1 to TAFE. She is artistic. They are all Christians, all living decent, productive lives. The cycle of displacement, despair and abuse has stopped. They are the living proof and fruit of my testimony that God does restore families and make all things new.